So the fifth chapter is the integumentary system. So the integumentary system is actually your skin. So it's an organ, which means it's made up of different types of tissues. There are two distinct regions in the skin, which are the epidermis and the dermis. The epidermis is the outermost superficial region that is pretty thin and is made up of closely packed epithelial cells. The dermis is a second region. It's the middle region. It's leathery, fibrous connective tissue, and it's made up of dense, irregular connective tissue that houses blood vessels, hair follicles, sweat glands, and other structures. And there's technically a third region if you want to consider the part below the top coat, so it would be the hypodermis. It's the deepest region, and it's composed of mainly loose connective fatty tissues. You might have heard this word hypo before in hypodermic needles. So hypo means deep. So the hypodermic needle, when you're getting an injection, is going to the deepest layer of the skin. So here you can see the three layers: the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. And this is all the fatty tissue in the hypodermis. This is all the adipose tissue. So the more body fat you have, the thicker the hypodermis layer will be. So the epidermis is composed of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, and it's consisting of 4 distinct cell types and 4 or 5 layers. So it's keratinized because there's a lot of protein keratin in it, and it forms keratinocytes. In the epidermis, you can see that it's smooth on top, but it's bumpy on the bottom. So the epithelium is composed of multiple layers of cells. The basal layer consists of cuboidal cells, whereas the outer layers are squamous, keratinized cells. So the whole epithelium is often described as being keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. So in epithelial cells, there's actually a thing called the final cytoskeleton filament, and that is the intermediate filament. So it helps resist compression and help anchor organelles within the cell. So as you can see in this, there's the long fibrous subunits of protein called keratin that are wound together like threads to compose a rope, and it maintains the cell's shape and structure. So in here you can see the cytoskeleton, and there are the little intermediate filaments of cells. Now there are 4 types of cells in the epidermis, which are the keratinocytes, melanocytes, Langerhans and Merkel cells. Keratinocytes produce the fibrous protein keratin. Melanocytes produce the brown pigment melanin. Langerhans cells are the epidermal macrophages that help activate the immune system. And Merkel cells, lastly, function as touch receptors in the association with sensory nerve endings. So more on keratinocytes. They produce the fibrous protein keratin, and millions rub off daily, so you get new skin around every 45 days. And little known fact is that most of the dust that's around your house, little dust mites and dust balls, that's mostly just you floating around. It's basically just your dead skin cells. Keratinocytes are also anchoring junction connections. Here are the anchoring junction connections. There's a desmosome, adherens, and hemidesmosome. You can see the intermediate filaments that we were just talking about with the keratin. And there are actually 3 basic types of cell-to-cell junctions. There are tight junctions, gap junctions, and anchoring junctions. Anchoring junctions, like the keratinocytes. So next on the cells, we have the melanocytes, and they produce the pigment melanin. They bound to granules called melanosomes and get transported to keratinocytes. Then they accumulate or bubble up on the sunny side of the nucleus, and they make a pigment shield protecting the nucleus. So with skin pigmentation, you can see there's dark and lighter skin. So the relative correlation of the skin depends on the amount of melanin produced by melanocytes in the stratum basale and taken up by the keratinocytes. So you can see in the dark and light skin, in the darker skin, you can see there's a whole bunch of melanocytes, whereas the lighter skin, there's like none. And you can see the melanosomes are very abundant over here, whereas in the light skin there aren't. So the more melanin you have produced, the darker your skin will be. And if you're tanning and you notice that your skin is getting darker, you're actually just staining the skin, the top layer of the skin, with the radiation of the UV light from the sun. So it's a very temporary stain because your keratinocytes and like your keratin on the top, that's just always coming off and rejuvenating. So the next on the cells, we have the epidermal dendritic cells, or the Langerhans cells. So they're epidermal macrophages that help activate the immune system. So I know dendritic might stuff you up just a little bit, but they're not neurons. Don't think dendrite like neurons. They just have a lot of branches. That's why they kind of look like dendrites. So they're not dendrites, they're not neurons, they just have branches. And they're phagocytes that activate the immune system, and there are lots of them that form a network. And there are three technical names for them. There's Langerhans cells, there's epidermal cells, dendritic cells, and there's epidermal macrophages. Here's a microphotograph of the Langerhans cell. So you can see these are the branches. These are not dendrites, not part of a neuron. These are branches. So next we have the Merkel cells. And so these are kind of like tactile cells. They function as touch receptors in association with sensory nerve endings. So tactile cell plus nerve endings equal tactile disc. They form a disc. This basically means Merkel cell plus nerve ending equals disc. So you can see the correlation between tactile cell and Merkel cell. They're basically the same thing. Just add a nerve ending and it becomes a disc. So there are 5 layers of thick skin of the epidermis, and that is the stratum corneum, the stratum lucidum, the stratum granulosum, the stratum spinosum, and the stratum basale. So starting from bottom to top, we have the stratum basale, and it's a basal layer. So the deepest epidermal layer firmly attached to the dermis. It consists of a single row of youngest keratinocytes, and the cells undergo rapid division. So they're always undergoing mitosis constantly. Second one is a stratum spinosum, and so that's where it's a prickly layer. So cells contain a web-like system of intermediate filaments attached to the desmosomes. The melanin granules and dendritic cells are abundant in this layer. So this is where also keratin gets formed too. Next up we have stratum granulosum. And so it's very thin, it's 3 to 5 cell layers in which drastic changes in keratinocytes appearance occurs. Keratinohyaline and laminated oil granules accumulate in the cells of this layer, as you can see, laminar granules. And the cells are still alive, but it's very slow mitosis. Then we have the stratum lucidum, and that's thin, transparent band superficial to the stratum granulosum. It consists of a few rows of flat, dead keratinocytes and is visible only in thick skin. So it's like the soles of your feet. Like, you can only see them on your calluses, and also there's no mitosis that is going on in this layer in the stratum lucidum. Next up, you have the stratum corneum. So the stratum corneum is the horny layer and is the outermost layer of the keratinized cells, and it accounts for 3/4 of the epidermal thickness. And some of the functions include waterproofing glycolipids between cells. Also, it forms protection from abrasion and penetration because of the keratin, because of the protein in them. And it's also rendering the body relatively insensitive to biological, chemical, and physical assaults. So it's very thick, very strong. Also in this photo, you can see the Merkel cells and the melanocytes, as we were talking before about them. And there's also the keratinocytes over here too, and the dead cells filled with keratin, like your little dust mites around your house. So now we're going to talk about the dermis. The dermis is the second major skin region containing strong, flexible connective tissue, and is thick, so it has a lot of collagen. So some cell types include fibroblasts, macrophages, and occasionally mast cells and white blood cells. So if you tan, if you get stained by the UV light, or skinned on the road or something like that, then it feels like leather. It's also composed of 2 layers, the papillary layer and the reticulary layer. This is reticular and papillary. So this small papillary layer is areolar connective tissue with collagen and elastic fibers. Its superficial surface contains peg-like projections and dermal papillae contain capillary loops, Meissner's corpuscles, and free nerve endings. So in fingers and feet on the top of the desmal ridges, these are like your fingerprints. They form epidermal ridges. So your fingerprints are the epidermal ridges, your little ridges that protrude. and they're just under the stratum basale of epidermis. They form the outermost layer, and they're delicate and makes connection between epidermis and dermis. And if you get a road rash and it hits the papillae level, this part, you might get a little bit of bleeding. Then we have the reticular layer, and it's dense, irregular connective tissue. It's about 80% thickness of the skin, and it's very strong. It's made up of elastin fibers, collagen, and it's able to recoil and is very resilient. And this is a microphotograph of the papillary layer and the reticular layer. Next, we're going to talk about the skin appendages. So there's the sweat glands, sebaceous glands, hair, and hair follicles and nails. But we're not really going to talk about or focus on hair and nails today. So the eccrine sweat gland are coiled glands in the dermis that release sweat and is mostly water. And then the sweat glands, there are different types. One prevents overheating of the body, another one secretes cerumen or like earwax, and the third one secretes milk. There's up to 3 million glands per person. Then we have sebaceous or oil glands, so they're found all over the body, and they soften skin when stimulated by hormones. They become active at puberty. So I'm going to talk about acne for a little bit because we're just talking about the sebaceous glands. And so acne is a result of overproductive sebaceous glands, which lead to a formation of blackheads and inflammation. So the white blood cells go into the acne, and pus is actually the dead blood white cells. And that concludes the integumentary system. Thank you.